Stanley started to say something to him, but no words came out of his mouth, and he had to try again. "How are you doing?" It hurt to talk. "Not good," Zero said quietly. With great effort, he rolled over, raised himself to the knees, and crawled to the waterhole. He lowered his head into it and lapped up some water. Then he jerked back, clutched his knees to the chest, and rolled to his side. His body shook violently. Stanley thought about going back down the mountain to look for the shovel, so he could make the waterhole deeper. Maybe that would give them cleaner water. They could use the jars as drinking glasses. But he didn't think he had the strength to go down, let alone make it back up again. And he didn't know where to look. He struggled to his feet. He was in the field of greenish-white flowers that seemed to extend all the way around the big thumb. He took a big breath, then walked the last 50 yards to giant priest's size and touched it. "Tag, you're it." Then he walked back to Zero and waterhole. On the way, he picked one of the flowers. It actually wasn't a big flower, he discovered, but instead each flower was really a cluster of tiny little flowers that formed around the bowl. He brought it to his mouth, but had to spit it out. He could see part of the trail he had made the night before when he carried the Zero up the mountain. If he was going to head back down and look for the shovel, he realized he should do it soon, while the trail was fresh. But he didn't want to leave Zero. He was afraid Zero might die while he was gone. Zero was still lying doubled over his side. "I got to tell you something," he said with groan. "Don't talk," said Stanley. "Save your strength." "No, listen," Zero insisted. Then he closed his eyes as his face twisted with pain. "I'm listening," Stanley whispered. "I took your shoes," Zero said. Stanley didn't know what he was talking about. His shoes were on his feet. "That's all right," he said. "Just rest now." "It's all my fault," said Zero. "It's nobody's fault," said Stanley. "I didn't know," Zero said. "That's okay," Stanley said. "Just rest." Zero closed his eyes, but then again he said, "I didn't know about the shoes." "What shoes?" "From the shelter." It took a moment for Stanley to comprehend. "Cloudy Livingstone's shoes?" "I'm sorry," said Zero. Stanley stared at him. It was impossible. Zero was delirious. Zero's compassion seemed to bring him some relief. The muscles in his face relaxed. As he drifted into sleep, Stanley softly sang him the song that had been in his family for generations. If only the woodpecker sighs, the bark on the tree was just a little bit softer, while the wolf lays below, hungry and lonely. He cries to the moon. If only, if only. When Stanley found the onion the night before, he didn't question how it had come to be there. He ate it gratefully. But now, as he sat gazing at Big Thumb and the meadow full of flowers, he couldn't help but wonder about it. If there was one wild onion, there could be more. He intertwined his fingers and tried to rub out the pain. Then he bent down and dug up another flower, this time pulling up the entire plant, including the root. "Onions, fresh hot sweet onions," Sam called as Mary Lou pulled the cart down Main Street. 8 cents a dozen. It was a beautiful spring morning. The sky was painted pale blue and pink, the same color as the lake and the peach trees along its shore. Mrs. Gladys Tennyson was wearing just her nightgown and robe as she came running down the street after Sam. Mrs. Tennyson was normally a very proper woman who never went out in public without dressing up in fine clothes and a hat. So it was quite surprising to the people of Green Lake to see her running past them. "Sam!" she shouted. "Wow, Marty Lou!" said Sam, stopping his mule and cart. "Good morning, Mrs. Tennyson," he said. "How's little Becca doing?" Gladys Tennyson was all smiles. "I think she's going to be all right. The fever broke about 1 hour ago, thanks to you. I'm sure the good Lord and the Dr. Houghton deserve most of the credit." "The good Lord, yes," agreed Mrs. Tennyson, "but not Dr. Houghton. That quack wanted to put leeches on her stomach. Leeches, my word. He said they would suck out the bad blood. Now, you tell me, how would a leech know good blood from bad blood?" "I wouldn't know," said Sam. "It was your onion tonic," said Mrs. Tennyson. "That's what saved her." Other town people made their way to the church. "Good morning, ladies," said Hattie Parker. "Don't you look lovely this morning?" Several people snickered. "Good morning, Hattie," Mrs. Tennyson replied. "Does your husband know you're parading about in your bad clothes?" Hattie asked. There were more sneakers. "My husband knows exactly where I am and how I am dressed, thank you," said Mrs. Tennyson. "We have both been up all night and half the morning with Rebecca. She almost died from stomach sickness. It seems that she ate some bad meat." Hattie's face flushed. Her husband, Jim Parker, was the butcher. "It made my husband and me sick as well," said Mrs. Tennyson, "but it nearly killed Becca. Sam saved her life." "It wasn't me," said Sam. "It was the onions." "I'm glad Becca is all right," Hattie said contritely. "I keep telling Jim he needs to wash his knives," said Mr. Pike, who owned the general store. Hattie Parker excused herself, then turned and quickly walked away. "Tell Becca that when she feels up to it, come by the store for a piece of candy," said Mr. Pike. "Thank you, I will do that." Before returning home, Mrs. Tennyson bought 12 onions from Sam. She gave him a dime and told him to keep the change. "I don't take a charity," Sam told her, "but if you want to buy a few extra onions for Mary Lou, I'm sure she would appreciate it." "All right then," said Mrs. Tennyson. "Give me my change in onions." Sam gave Mrs. Tennyson an additional 3 onions, and she fed them at a time to Mary Lou. She laughed as the old donkey ate them out of her hand. Stanley and Zero slept off and on for the next 2 days, ate onions, all they wanted, and splashed dirty water into their mouth. In the late afternoon, Big Thumb gave them shade. Stanley tried to make the hole deeper, but he really needed the shovel. His efforts just seemed to stir up the mud and make the water dirtier. Zero was sleeping. He was still very sick and weak, but the sleep and the onion seemed to be doing him some good. Stanley was no longer afraid that he would die soon. Still, he didn't want to go for the shovel while Zero was asleep. He didn't want him to wake up and think he'd been deserted. He waited for Zero to open his eyes. "I think I will go for the shovel," Stanley said. "I will wait here," Zero said feebly, as if he had any other choice. Stanley headed down the mountain. The sleep and the onions had done him a lot of good as well. He felt strong. It was fairly easy to follow the trail he had made 2 days earlier. There were a few places where he wasn't sure he was going the right way, but it just took a little bit of searching before he found the trail again. He went quite a way down the mountain, but still didn't find the shovel. He looked back up toward the top of the mountain. He must have walked right past it, he thought. There was no way he could have carried Zero all the way up from here. Still, he headed downward, just in case. He came to a bare spot between 2 large patches of weeds and sat down to the rest. Now he had definitely gone too far, he decided. He was tired out from walking down the hill. It would have been impossible to have carried Zero up the hill from here, especially after walking all day with no food or water. The shovel must be buried in some weeds. Before starting back up, he took one last look around all directions. He saw a large indentation in the weeds a little farther down the mountain. It didn't seem likely that the shovel could be there, but he would already come this far. There, lying in some tall weeds, he found the shovel and the sack of shells. He was amazed. He wondered if the shovel and sack might have rolled down the hill. But none of the shells was broken, except the one which had broken earlier. And if they had rolled down the hill, it is doubtful that he would have found the sack and shovel side by side. On his way back up the mountain, Stanley had to sit down and rest several times. It was a long, hard climb. Zero's condition continued to improve. Stanley slowly peeled an onion. He liked eating them one layer at a time. The water hole was now almost as large as the holes he had dug back at Camp Green Lake. It contained almost 2 feet of murky water. Stanley had dug it all himself. Zero had offered to help, but Stanley thought it better for Zero to save his strength. It was a lot harder to dig in water than it was in dry lake. Stanley was surprised that he himself hadn't gotten sick, either from splush, the dirty water, or from living on onions. He used to get sick quite a lot back at home. Both boys were barefoot. They had washed their socks. All their clothes were very dirty, but their socks were definitely the worst.